What if thread could carry vengeance? What if the gentle hum of a needle through cloth was not the sound of servitude, but the whisper of retribution? Who was the woman whose calloused fingers stitched silence into silk, who turned her suffering into a weapon sharper than any blade? This is the story of Louisa in Tennessee, 1853, where every garment became a secret graveyard of revenge. The Tennessee sun was merciless in the summer of 1853. It scorched the red, clay soil, blistered the air, and beat down on the cotton fields, where men and women bent their backs until spines curved like sickles. Among them was Louisa, though her hands were not in the soil, but in thread. She was a house slave, a seamstress whose duty was to stitch the garments of the family who owned her. The big house, white-pillared and looming, cast its shadow across the slave cabins like a reminder. You belong here, and never there. Louisa lived in that shadow. Her life measured in garments finished, hems straightened, and fabrics pressed for the family, who never looked her in the eye unless something was wrong. Her fingers bore the evidence of her servitude, pricked, scarred, and hardened. They knew no softness. Every day, she threaded the needle by the dim light of a candle in the sewing room. Lace for the mistress, vests for the master, dresses for their daughters. Louisa's work was invisible, yet indispensable. Her needle carried the weight of the household's pride, and yet behind her lowered eyes, behind the quiet obedience anger, lived. Not anger that erupted like fire, but anger that burned slow, steady, deep. She had seen too much to let it cool. The lashings on the backs of men she called brothers. The sale of children whose cries had not yet learned silence. The way the mistress's voice, cold and brittle, would remind her that she was property, not person. Louisa stitched silently, but her thoughts screamed. Sometimes, she pressed the needle hard into her finger, just to feel a pain she could control. Sometimes, she imagined pulling the thread through not silk, but flesh. She never told a soul. What the family did not know was that Louisa had once been taught by her grandmother back in Virginia about plants, roots that healed, leaves that burned, seeds that killed. Her grandmother whispered that nature held both mercy and wrath, that God himself placed power in the soil for those wise enough to recognize it. Louisa had never forgotten. At night, while the family feasted on meats and wine, she would wander near the edges of the fields, gathering small things no one noticed, green leaves with bitter veins, berries that birds refused, seeds that, when ground, released a powder sharp as death itself. The sewing room became her altar, the garments her offering, the thread her weapon. She would hum softly while she worked hymns she had learned in the quarters, notes that sounded like sorrow but carried determination. And as she stitched, she began to imagine, what if the very clothes that touched their skin carried the same poison they forced upon her life? What if the master's vest carried death in every seam, his sweat waking the venom from her threads? The thought grew, swelling inside her chest until her heart beat not with fear, but with purpose. Louisa was no longer just a seamstress. She was an executioner in waiting. The summer dragged on, each day sharpening her quiet rage. She smiled when the mistress praised her fine stitching, though the smile never reached her eyes. She lowered her head when the master barked at her, though her mind was already sewing his grave. The needle clicked, the thread pulled, the plan began. And by the end of that summer, Louisa's fingers trembled not from exhaustion, but from anticipation. Rumors drifted through the quarters like smoke. Someone whispered of a runaway caught and whipped until his body broke. Someone else whispered of a girl taken in the night by the overseer. Each whisper wrapped tighter around Louisa's ribs until she could scarcely breathe. The big house family laughed louder that season, their parties grander, their dresses more lavish. They wore wealth on their bodies as if it were armor, never realizing that the very garments they flaunted could become their undoing. Louisa had begun her work, quietly, carefully. She did not rush. Each poisoned stitch was hidden in plain sight, a collar reinforced with thread dusted in powder, the hem of a dress lined with a tincture that seeped invisible into the skin, a waistcoat sewn with seams that carried death like a secret prayer. She worked alone, but her silence was not loneliness. It was protection. No one could know, not even the women who shared her cabin at night. To tell was to risk, and risk was death. This vengeance was hers alone, stitched in secrecy. At times, fear gnawed at her. What if the family discovered her work before it was finished? What if suspicion fell on her? The lash, the gallows, the fire. She knew the punishments too well, and yet when she thought of the master's voice booming through the halls, or the mistress's hand striking a child for dropping a dish, her fear turned to iron. The clothes were finished one by one, returned to closets and wardrobes, where their owners would unknowingly slip them on. Louisa watched from the edges of rooms, her heart pounding when the mistress twirled in a new gown, when the master adjusted his vest before a mirror. She listened for coughs, for weakness, for the creeping shadow of sickness. Days passed, weeks, and then it began. The master complained of fatigue, his voice losing its thunder. The mistress grew pale, her appetite vanishing. Their daughters shivered, even in the sweltering Tennessee heat. Physicians were summoned, tonics prescribed, nothing worked. The poison moved slowly, patient as Louisa's needle. The quarters buzzed with speculation. Some slaves whispered it was God's punishment. Others dared not speak at all, fearing the lash of suspicion. Louisa said nothing, but at night, when she pressed her palm against her chest, she could feel her heart beating with both terror and triumph. Still, danger pressed closer. The overseer's eyes narrowed whenever sickness was mentioned. The mistress, delirious in her bed, accused servants of witchcraft. The master demanded answers, his voice ragged, but still sharp enough to wound. Louisa knew it was only a matter of time before someone pointed to her, the quiet seamstress whose hands had touched every garment in the house. And so, she prepared, not just for vengeance, but for escape. She began to gather scraps, needles, thread, small bundles of dried roots that might keep her alive if she fled into the woods. She listened to whispers of the Underground Railroad, of safe houses northward, of freedom that lay beyond rivers and mountains. Her plan was no longer just to destroy, but to survive the destruction. The night came when the mistress collapsed during supper, her body trembling as if the very air burned her veins. Panic rippled through the big house. The master shouted. Servants scrambled. Louisa stood still in the doorway, her eyes calm, her hands folded before her like a woman in prayer. She knew the end was near, whether theirs or hers. The big house, once a monument of control, had become a place of whispers and dread. Curtains stayed drawn, visitors kept away. The family weakened with each passing day, their laughter replaced by groans that echoed through the halls. Louisa moved silently among them, her presence unnoticed in their sickness. She brought linens, fetched water, adjusted pillows. Duties that once humiliated her now felt like victory. With each garment they wore, with each bead of sweat that carried poison deeper into their blood, her revenge was stitched tighter. But shadows gathered around her. The overseer, suspicious and watchful, muttered that the sickness was no ordinary fever. The master, delirious but dangerous, swore he would find the devil in his house. A doctor whispered the word arsenic, and suddenly eyes turned toward the kitchens, the pantries, the servants. One night, Louisa heard her name whispered, not by a friend, not by an ally, but by fear itself. Someone had seen her linger too long in the sewing room. Someone had noticed her herbs drying in the corner of her cabin. The noose of suspicion tightened, and yet she did not falter. She finished what she began. The last gown she delivered to the mistress's chamber carried the heaviest weight of all. As she draped it across the bed, she whispered a hymn under her breath, not of sorrow, but of freedom. Days later, the mistress was dead. Soon after, the master followed. Their daughters weakened until they too could no longer rise from their beds. The big house that had stood as a symbol of dominance now stood as a tomb. But Louisa's victory was bitter. Whispers in the quarters spread. Some praised her as an avenger. Others feared her as cursed. And the overseer? He was certain now. Guards were ordered. Searches began. Louisa knew her time was measured in hours. She did not wait for the rope. Under cover of night, with only the moon to guide her, she slipped away from the plantation. She carried nothing but a small bundle, her grandmother's whispered knowledge, and the weight of what she had done. Every rustle in the trees was danger, every dog's bark in the distance a threat, but she pressed on, step by step, northward. Some say she made it, that Louisa crossed into freedom, disappearing into the whispers of the Underground Railroad. Others say she was caught, dragged back, and silenced before a crowd as a warning. History does not record her end. What remains is the story, the haunting memory of a woman who turned needle into dagger, who stitched her rage into the very fabric of her oppressors' lives. What if vengeance is not written in blood, but in thread? What if silence itself becomes the sharpest blade? And what if Louisa, the seamstress of Tennessee, still walks among youths in every story of resistance, in every whisper of justice delayed but never denied? The needle drops. The thread pulls. The story is sewn shut.